Now to former Trump campaign chairman Paul Manafort, who's facing 7.5 years in prison now following a second sentencing hearing. In court yesterday, a federal judge tacked on an additional 3.5 years to the 47-month sentence he received last week. Seated in a wheelchair, Manafort told the courtroom, quote, "I'm sorry for what I have done and for all of the activities that have gotten us here today." The judge responded, telling Manafort, quote, "Saying I'm sorry I got caught is not an inspiring call for leniency." The judge also chided Manafort's lawyers for using the charges in the case to try to disprove collusion between the Trump campaign and Russian efforts to influence the 2016 election, saying, quote, "The question of whether there was or was not any coordination or conspiracy or any collusion between anyone associated with the presidential campaign and anyone in Russia was not presented in this case, period. Therefore, it was not resolved one way or the other by this case." But here's what Manafort's lead attorney had to say outside the courtroom.
Judge Jackson conceded that there was absolutely no evidence of any Russian collusion in this case. So that makes two courts have ruled no evidence of any collusion with any Russian.
I feel very badly for Paul Manafort, and he worked for Ronald Reagan very successfully. He worked for John McCain. He worked for Bob Dole and many others for many years. And I feel badly for him. I think it's a very sad situation.
Will you pardon Paul Manafort?
I have not even given it a thought as of this moment. It's not something that's right now on my mind. I do feel badly for Paul Manafort.
But Paul Manafort's legal troubles don't stop there. Less than an hour after his sentencing yesterday, prosecutors in Manhattan announced new criminal charges had been filed against him. Court documents obtained by NBC News show a Manhattan grand jury has indicted Manafort on 16 counts alleging a multi-million-dollar mortgage fraud scheme. Manhattan District Attorney Cyrus Vance Jr. says the indictment grew out of an investigation that began in March of 2017 when prosecutors began to look at loans Manafort received from two banks. Unlike the two federal cases that have resulted in prison time for Manafort, President Trump does not have the authority to pardon Manafort if he's convicted on these new charges. Let's bring in NBC News intelligence and national security reporter Ken Dilanian and MSNBC legal analyst Danny Cevallos. Guys, so much to get to. Danny, let me start with you first. We talked yesterday at this time. We wondered whether or not the sentences would be consecutive or concurrent. What do you make of Judge Jackson's decision yesterday?
The answer to whether they would be concurrent or consecutive apparently was yes. Federal judges have considerable authority in whether or not to impose a concurrent, consecutive, or a partially concurrent sentence. And that's exactly what Judge Jackson did, was split the difference. The sentencing guidelines called for concurrent sentences, but only if the judge concluded that this was relevant conduct with the prior sentence. And ultimately, the sentencing guidelines have been only advisory for the last 15 years, so the judge doesn't even have to follow the sentencing guidelines. She exercised her considerable discretion and meted out a sentence that she thought was appropriate and partially concurrent so that he can serve double time and also still serves time for her sentence individually.
So, Ken, for the second time in a week, Paul Manafort's attorney leaves the courtroom after a sentencing, goes on the courtroom steps and says there was no collusion, having nothing to do what was just settled in the courtroom behind him. As Judge Jackson pointed out, that case also was not about collusion. What's he up to here?
Well, it was remarkable, Willie. He didn't just say there was no collusion. As you played, he said two courts have ruled there's no evidence of collusion. That is such a bald-faced misstatement that it almost could not be sort of him just misspeaking there, because that just completely at odds with what he was just told by the judge in the courtroom an hour before, and he did it twice. And so I think it's no surprise, therefore, that the Manhattan DA felt compelled to move forward with a case, because it sure looks like Kevin Downing, Paul Manafort's team, is playing for a pardon from the president. Why else would they continue to stress this idea of no evidence of collusion when none of these cases were about collusion? In fact, what they were about, as this judge made clear, and the judge in Virginia did not, is that Paul Manafort ran a 10-year fraud not just on the IRS, but on the American public, because he was lobbying for a Russian-backed Ukrainian oligarch, often contrary to American interests. That's what this judge made clear yesterday, that, you know, we rely on people to register when they're representing foreign governments and lobbying in America as part of the transparency that we use for our democracy. And Manafort flouted that. He chose not to register. He chose to evade taxes on the millions he was paid. And the judge made all that clear, as opposed to Judge Ellis in Virginia, who said that Manafort had lived an otherwise blameless life. Now, at the end of the day, for various technical legal reasons, she imposed a sentence that was not even as long as the one that Judge Ellis imposed, which was very controversial. But, you know, all told, Paul Manafort's going to do 7.5 years. You know, he'll get some time knocked off for time served in good behavior. He'll be 76 years old when he gets out. That's a pretty big chunk of time for a white-collar case like this, Willie.
So, Jonathan, clearly Manafort's attorneys in both cases, this yesterday and last week, is speaking directly to the White House. There was no collusion. There was no collusion. Is the White House hearing those signals for a potential pardon?
Well, the judge also said that in that courtroom, facts matter, and it seems like the Manafort's attorney doesn't believe that with these public statements, which are clearly directed to that audience of one, which is President Trump. And we heard him yesterday echo that erroneous conclusion that there was no collusion decided in that case. He himself said it again when talking about Manafort. I talked to Rudy Giuliani just in the last day or so about this, and he said that the president's stance on this has been consistent, that they have talked about in broad strokes about the concept of pardons, not specifically for Manafort, but said that nothing would be decided until this investigation was all over. That doesn't mean the courtroom proceedings for Manafort. That means the Mueller probe. Now, that, we believe, is coming to a conclusion in the next few weeks or so. So there may be some movement on this soon. The president, yes, we heard him yesterday say, I haven't thought about this. That's not quite accurate. There have certainly been discussions in the White House about potentials for pardons. Nothing has been promised yet, but it is something that the Manafort team is clearly eyeing. It seems like every step of their public relations strategy and some of their legal defense strategy has been to end up with the point where the president could issue him a pardon.
And something the White House, at least privately, is considering.
There has been some discussions, sure.
So, Danny, I mentioned also that the Manafort's troubles are not over. Manhattan District Attorney handed down a 16-count indictment almost immediately after the sentencing in federal court yesterday. What's the significance of that beyond the fact that the president cannot pardon Manafort in that case?
You're absolutely right. The president's pardon power is almost unlimited, but it does not reach state crimes. However, Manafort may have another tool in his defense, and that's double jeopardy. There are two different kinds of double jeopardy that can apply. There's constitutional double jeopardy, and New York has a separate statute that addresses double jeopardy that bars successive prosecutions. They're a little different. The New York law looks at the facts. If the prosecution arises out of substantially similar facts, it may be barred as an improper successive prosecution for the same crime. On the other hand, the constitutional analysis is a little more technical. It's strictly legal. You look at the two different crimes, and if each contains an element that the other does not, then they're different under the analysis, and that does not violate double jeopardy. But expect Manafort's lawyers to raise this defense, and quickly.
Meanwhile, Ken, NPR is reporting this morning that one of the most prominent members of Special Counsel Robert Mueller's team, Andrew Weissmann, soon will leave the office and the Justice Department. That's according to two sources. Weissmann's departure could be one of the strongest signs yet that Mueller and his team have all but concluded their work. Ken, do you think that's what's happening here? Is Bob Mueller wrapping things up?
That's certainly what law enforcement officials and congressional officials have been telling us for weeks, Willie, and this, I think, is the latest sign. Weissmann led the arguments yesterday in court against Paul Manafort, and Manafort was the highest profile prosecution brought by Mueller. And, there's a lot of speculation that even if the Mueller indictment or the Mueller investigation is moving to a close, that there may be more indictments coming. Well, we've seen no evidence that the grand jury has even met since the Roger Stone indictment. And the idea that Andrew Weissmann would leave the office with a major case still hanging out there is just really hard for many people to believe. He's the guy that, remember, Steve Bannon called the LeBron James of money laundering. He's the killer. He's the guy who did the Enron prosecution. He used to head the fraud section of the Justice Department. He left a job teaching at universities, and he supposedly is going to go back to doing that. It's really difficult to imagine that he would be leaving with major business unfinished. And so we do expect a Mueller report to be sent over to the DOJ sometime in the next few weeks. We're hoping that we'll learn about that on the day that it happens. And then we wait and see what exactly Attorney General William Barr decides to do in terms of making that public. But whatever he does, Willie, congressional Democrats will not be satisfied until they get every stitch of documentation that Robert Mueller has provided.
Rick, quick question on the politics of pardoning Manafort, because we've had a bunch of Republicans come out and say they don't think this is a good idea, including Lindsey Graham. Does the president get blowback if he does go that route?
Possible, not with his base, but with more mainstream Republicans. I think and these are, and I agree with Ken. These are actually light sentences. She gave him 43 months, and the supposedly lenient judge gave 47 months. But I think that actually works against him in terms of a pardon, because the shorter the sentence, it's much easier for the president to say, well, he got a short sentence, he'll be out soon. If he got life or like 20 years, he would have had a much better case to pardon him. Now he doesn't.
Ken Delaney and Danny Cevallos, thank you both very much. Still ahead on Morning Joe. An image in the New York Times illustrates the deadly paths of two Boeing jetliners that crashed in recent months as the pilots apparently wrestled for control against the plane's computers. We'll talk about the administration's belated decision to ground that aircraft following the footsteps of several other countries around the world. You're watching Morning Joe. We'll be right back.
Pardoning Manafort would be seen as a political disaster for the president. There may come a day down the road after the politics have changed that you'd want to consider an application for him like everybody else, but now it would be a disaster.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.